Greetings everyone. I'm indeed very happy to be here in this great country and a very historic city, Saint-Petersburg. And thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. In all places where I have taught history, in Africa, the history of Russia, I must say, features prominently from the history of Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev and issues of the Cold War and so on. So I must say the history of Russia is very deeply rooted in African historiography, African textbooks, and in the general teaching of history. I'm originally from Cameroon, but I reside in South Africa, where I work as a lecturer of history and social science education at the Saint-Petersburg University. Listening to all the presentations today, it is very clear that Africa is not unique in its trends of history teaching, and that maybe gives us some impetus to work as a global community collectively to address some of those trends that I'll be talking about in this presentation. If you can please go to the next slide. This is a very brief presentation because some of the things have been mentioned already, so I'll not really over-elaborate on those points. I'm just going to give a brief context that I want to state as a disclaimer, and then I'm going to speak to three trends: the idea of historical thinking. Sorry. Okay, I can change this. Thank you. The idea of historical thinking, school history for political purposes, and the role of history textbooks. Then I'm going to consolidate and conclude the presentation. To start with, Africa is a very big place. Africa is a continent with multi-layered and complex realities. So when I present on the main trends of history teaching in Africa, I cannot attempt to be reductionist in my views on these trends. So my presentation is therefore based on my observations as a history teacher from three contexts, predominantly, like I mentioned in the background, teaching history in Cameroon, teaching history in South Africa, and I have also taught history in Lesotho, which is another African country. So based on those observations and experiences, I want to establish certain trends that I'm sharing with you. It is by no means representative of the reality of the big continent called Africa. The idea of historical thinking is an idea that has been mentioned from the very first presentation. Historical thinking, by definition here, is the use of critical skills to process information about the past. My observation from the context where I have operated in Africa is that historical thinking has not really taken hold in Africa. Memory history, rather than analytical history, is still what is mostly favored. And the focus of teaching in those contexts of history teaching is on substantive knowledge, is the knowledge of the facts, is the knowledge of the content of history, rather than on the procedural knowledge, which is about the skills, what we also call the second-order concepts, issues of historical empathy, issues of historical significance, issues of cause and effect. Those inquiry skills are not really promoted in this context. And there are reasons why this kind of skills are not promoted. So we are going to see some of those reasons when we talk about the next point. And I give this quotation here, that you give me wrong ideas, or you give me wrong facts, I give you wrong marks. it is quoting my own secondary school teacher. They used to tell us that. If you give me wrong facts, I give you wrong marks. So what this says is just an emphasis on history as a body of information that doesn't allow you as a student to think outside of what the teacher is giving you. So the truth is what the teacher is giving you. The fact is what the teacher is giving you. All you have to do is to give it back to the teacher in the form of a test or an exam. So there are no opportunities for you as a learner or as a student to engage that content, to apply your inquiry skills, to ask questions about that content. And that is why this teacher made that comment there. So it is not really source-based, it is a body of knowledge. So a typical history textbook in, for instance, Cameroon, is a textbook that has narratives and the narratives of historical content, of stories, with no sources that give students opportunities to engage with those narratives. Finally here, the global north idea that does not translate well into Africa. We have talked about Eurocentrism and knowledge from the global north. That is still seen as historical truth as opposed to Afrocentric ideas. So you will see contents such as the Jewish massacre, for instance, that is very prominent in African curricula. But you hear nothing about the massacre of certain indigenous people in different African spaces being taught in African curricula. Not to undermine the historical significance of the Jewish massacre, but to say that Africans would prefer to highlight a development that happened in Germany at the expense of so many similar developments, right, that happened in African continent, is that favoring of Eurocentric history and knowledge that comes from the global north as opposed to the same kind of developments that happen in Africa. The next issue is the school history for political purposes. And this is closely tied to the previous point. So school history is most often used powerfully for political purposes. And that is the reason why the curriculum and the textbooks does not allow for critical thinking. Because what does critical thinking do? It helps you to ask questions. And politics does not really favor asking of questions. Because when you ask questions, then you become enlightened. Your mind becomes broad. Then maybe you can hear about things that the regime or the system does not want you to know about. The idea of sanitized history, especially in conflict or post-conflict context. And when I talk about conflict context here, maybe the case of Cameroon that is currently in context, so the history is being sanitized, formal history, clean history. There are things we are not expected to tell these people. Because what? If you tell them through teaching of history, through including it in the textbook, then it might spur a revolution. It might spur a rebellion. So you find that certain critical aspects of Cameroonian history are silenced from the curriculum, are silenced from the textbook. Because children are not supposed to know these things. Because if they know these things, then the problem comes. It's the same with post-conflict societies. South Africa, for instance, is a post-conflict society. So there is the interest of the system to make sure that certain things are done in a certain way. So school history is by no means neutral. There's a hand of somebody who is powerful in determining what should be taught and how it should be taught in the textbooks, in the curriculum, and so on. We also have, as part of the political purpose of history, the idea of the great men, the big men, the idea of history that is the story of big men to the exclusion of the activities or the contributions of the common man, to the contributions of women, for instance. So a typical history textbook will tell you about Nelson Mandela, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and all of that. But you will hardly see the contributions of the common man, you will hardly see the contributions of women. So that is another trend. And maybe let me go to the last slide. But the last point here, some countries have even removed history from the curriculum. Okay, this is the last one. So some countries, because of this toxic nature, excuse the word, toxic nature of historical content, some countries have just tended to remove history as a subject in the syllabus because of the controversy that it brings with. An example is a country like Nigeria. So Nigeria has flip-flopped around including history and removing history because of the contributions that history can make that they're not comfortable with. Others have blurred it as part of social studies. This point was made earlier. So rather than have history as a standalone subject, you have it now as part of social studies, as part of social sciences. South Africa, for instance, teaches history at intermediate level as part of social sciences, at the senior phase level as part of social sciences. And it only becomes an independent subject when you get to a stage that they call the further education and training. That is a deliberate attempt to reduce the impact of history. And others are still having serious conversations on the merit of history, such as Lesotho. And lastly, colleagues, the role of the textbook that has really been talked about. Textbooks are generally not neutral, in my view. They are important pedagogic instruments, indispensable, in my view, but also hugely ideological and hugely political. Textbooks serve as a compromise between experts and politicians, and these are groups with sometimes competing agendas. So to what extent is the expert, that textbook author who is an expert, able to independently cause their content to be part of the school system without the influence of lawmakers and so on? And that's why my question earlier to the textbook author. In so many of African countries, there is a very strict textbook approval process that is informed by politics and ideological lines. And these textbooks as well carry ideas from global north rather than Afrocentric historical focus. So we have the problem of textbooks as well. In conclusion, the division between academic history and other varieties is not too sharp in Africa. Academic or official history is only one of the ways of approaching the past. Africans also learn history through telling it, through songs, through what they produce in the form of dance, in the form of recitations, in the form of painting, and so on. So writing, talking, and performing the past are very important forms of history outside of the professional history that is taught in schools formally. Even though these forms, we agree that they need scrutiny, the end point should not be to reincarnate this old discourse that Africans are people without a history. Actually, Africa has a very, very deep-rooted history. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you and thank you.
I promise that.
Very good.
как у вас проходит отбор авторов учебников? А как у вас происходит отбор авторов учебников?
Okay, like I mentioned, thank you for the question. Like I mentioned, I can't speak for the whole of Africa, but I can talk for specific context. In the case of Cameroon, for example, it is largely a government issue, and that is why there's a problem with the textbooks that end up being part of the system to be used in schools. Because if the narrative in the textbook does not favor a government agenda, then your textbook will never feature. So there's a committee set up by the government called the National Textbook Committee. And each year, that committee will request textbooks from textbook authors and publishers. They will review the textbooks to make sure that the content is sanitized, that the content is something that they agree with, and the content that is not maybe in favor of a government narrative will not feature in the textbook. And that is why sometimes textbook authors get compromised, because you have your textbook, you want it to be used in the schools, but if you don't agree with a certain narrative, then it will not feature in the schools. So textbook authors therefore have to make a decision on, do I want my textbook to be in the school, or do I want a textbook that carries a certain ideology of objectivity? So it's a huge decision that textbook authors have to make. Because of the financial benefits that come with having your textbook in the school system, unfortunately, so many authors end up being compromised. They fall for what the system wants. I hope that answers the question.
I want to ask this question. Why did you use the term Africa, the title of your presentation, instead of history textbooks in South Africa, Cameroon, and so on?
Okay, this was actually the organizers. In my discussion with the organizers, they said they would like me to present on trends in history teaching in Africa. So it was a suggestion. So I said, okay, that's fine, but my focus will be on specific contexts that I'm familiar with. Hence, I made that disclaimer at the beginning that the trends that I'll be talking about is in no way a representative of a representation in Africa. Because I am totally against that notion sometimes that refers to Africa as one people, refers to Africa as a country. Africa is a continent made up of so many different countries. So this was just my observations and my readings about certain trends, especially informed by my experiences of these three contexts.
Yeah.